We've discovered patterns.
The connection was always there.
This changes everything we thought we knew about human health.
Hello, welcome everyone to Health Revealed. My name is Cory Endrulat. I am joined by Stephanie MoDavis and Leslie Powers. Welcome back to our interview series, where we will be sharing with you more amazing guests and unique or untold perspectives to shift the current paradigm of health in all the institutions in our world, from the micro to the macro, the individual to the collective. We aspire to connect the mainstream and the alternative, integrating all the different solutions they have to share. We welcome you to participate in this whole project with us, share your story, your resources with us. This is a fully independent project because we care deeply about our world. We believe that true healing and true freedom is indeed possible. And in these interviews, we also want to provide you with practical action steps that you can take in your own life to better your own health. So without further ado, our fantastic guest today is Liev Dalton, also known as the creator and host of Beyond Terrain. He's a health educator and thought leader with a background in biochemistry, molecular biology, and biomedical sciences. He helps people eliminate brain fog, chronic fatigue, and fear by reclaiming physical, mental, and spiritual sovereignty through terrain theory, natural healing, nervous system regulation, and aligning with nature's principles over conventional medicine. As the host of Beyond Terrain, he runs a popular podcast and private community featuring long-form discussions on health, wisdom, personal responsibility, and challenging institutional narratives with doctors, researchers, and philosophers. So I'll head it over to Leslie.
Hi, thank you so much, Liv. Glad you're here. And I'm wondering if there was a core turning point or a personal experience that led you to create Beyond Terrain. And if so, how did it reshape your understanding of what health actually is?
I had quite a paradigm shift of my own, being in kind of the, institutionalized academia, studying biochemistry and molecular, as you mentioned. And I couldn't have been further on the other side. Like I took the microbiology courses, I studied virology, I studied all of these techniques quite in depth, right, at the, biochemical level. Now, I do think that there's a great reduction in all of that, which I'm sure we could probably talk about at some capacity. But um, the turning point for me, it was having some time for myself, some introspection. And when I was gifted this time with the whole COVID narrative. Obviously, we all um, went through that, and with that, I spent a lot of time outside. I spent a lot of time reflecting on sort of my journey, my path. What is the meaning of all this? What's the purpose of my life? How can I increase the good that I do? The path that I was going down, I was going to be a dental surgeon, and I was in it just purely for financial reasons. And I realized obviously that wasn't my path, and I wanted to do something more meaningful and helpful to improve the world. And in doing so, I realized that I have to become the best version of myself, and so I challenged all of these narratives that I thought were true. I challenged biochemical narratives, cell theory, virology, you name it, I've challenged it, because that's really what science is all about. So I didn't just believe the terrain the first time I sort of heard about it. I spent a lot of time actually trying to disprove this whole concept of the terrain, and prove the germ theory correct. And in doing so, this was actually one of the first kind of deep dives that I did. In doing so, I ended up disproving and falsifying the germ theory. I read all the contagion studies. I read, the fundamental literature on it and the more modern literature. And that was the turning point. It was when I had the courage to say, okay, maybe I'm wrong about this stuff, or maybe maybe that's not even the right way to say it, but maybe that I've been told a story that's not true. And so I think that was the fundamental turning point for me and my journey, because from there now I don't shy away from any discussion. I'm happy to have absolutely any discussion. People challenge my beliefs and views all the time, and it just makes me a better person, and it just refines, my thoughts and the content that I'm putting out into the world as well. So this is what science is about, and philosophy. This is the point. right? And so I do it from a very educational standpoint and try to turn these things into actionable things that we can do. And it's always individual, right? Health is very individual. Life is very individual. We're all on our individual paths, as we were chatting before, right? We all kind of do our own thing and contribute to this world in different ways. And I think that's what makes, the human race so amazing as well, right? That we can all collaborate and that our collective consciousness can work together. So all of these things were gifted to me, and they were realizations, things that I, remembered, I suppose, on my journey. So I'm sure we'll probably dive into lots of them today. So that was the big turning point for me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I know that this is a really big paradigm shift for most people. And, you talk about reclaiming health and wisdom and personal sovereignty. What does that look like in the everyday life, right, for the average person who's stuck in this current system?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Dispelling the fear, I think, is really an important step. It's breaking down this fear-based victim consciousness, right? I think the first step is deciding within yourself that it's time to take responsibility for your life, right? And we can get caught in all of these narratives. Actually did a master's in counseling psychology, and I worked as a therapist. I'm not in that field anymore. It was very limiting. Um, but even in working in the psychological world with people, I found that I started to partake in this narrative that we are a victim to our trauma, and I feel like this is a big topic of discussion nowadays. Um, and this is what I mean when I say I don't fear kind of questioning myself. I don't fear, going back on things that maybe I thought in the past that just they don't serve me, right? Like, and I think this was one of the fundamental shifts that I had. It's I don't have a dog in this fight. I don't, what I do right now, I try to live to the best of my capabilities. And in 20, 30, 40 years, that's going to look different,
Mhm.
And so every season that you're in, it's always going to be different. And I think the one fundamental thing is that taking responsibility, right? And so I could dive into the rite of passage as being an important part of this step, right? Is that rite of passage is fundamentally dispelling that fear and building courage, right? And esteeming oneself, right? Having this sort of journey that we went through it and saying, yeah, I did that, and it kind of, we build ourselves, right? Where we go through these things where we learn and we grow and we become better. And then this is positive feedback cycle, right? And so now I just had a daughter about 3 months ago, and I think that's another way of sort of excelling uh, our consciousness, our being, our vitality on a very physical level, right? Because you have to take more responsibility than ever,
Mhm.
right? And I think these are some of the concepts that we have to remember. It's getting back to simplicity.
Mhm.
And we get back to simplicity and we realize that, okay, like a lot of these narratives are designed to be coping mechanisms, right? For us to not have to take responsibility for our lives.
Right.
Right. And that's just a form of coping, right? Like it's like, oh, well, it's not me, it's my genetics, or it's my trauma, or it's the germs, right? None of it's my fault, and this is not a blame, good or bad type thing that doesn't exist in nature. There's only adaptation, right? I know Corey and I have spoken a lot about the appeal to nature fallacy and the flaws and how it's used in the modern world. Appealing to nature is fundamentally one of the only truths that we know. And when we do that, we again dispel the fear, right? And I think that I could probably center that discussion around that point, right? Esteeming ourselves, building ourselves up, focusing on these positive things, focusing on these empowering narratives that I think that we're all talking about nowadays. I think that's the fundamental step. And it's deciding within, right? Like that's the underlying thing that I've seen when I work with people, when I talk with people who've been, through the ringer. you can do all of these different practices and protocols, but it's not until you decide that you want to be healthier, be better, increase your vitality, increase your whatever it may be. It's not until you make that decision that it can finally happen, right? So it's a very, internal starting point, I suppose.
Yeah, I
And I
love
suppose
that.
one thing I didn't mention is faith, which is everything.
Mhm.
And I brushed over that, but I think that again is the antidote to fear. Faith in something big or something interconnected, something all knowing, so all loving, right? Like that's a center point as well. So
Yeah, and I'll just highlight that I think implicit in what you're saying is the willingness to ask questions and to be
sure.
willing to reconsider assumptions and to be open, right? Yeah, yeah.
Well, and
So,
and I think that's a great point. Sorry to chime in one more time here, but um, when it comes to the professors that I was learning from in these institutions, I would ask questions and they wouldn't even consider looking, right? So talk a lot about this one story in genetics, and we were learning about PCR on the most fundamental level, and she mentioned in lecture that anything over 33 cycles is completely scientific obsolete. And I said, okay, well, why is the CDC issue a document that say we're running it at 45 cycles? And you're telling me anything above 33 cycles is scientifically obsolete. How does this make any sense? And, I asked this question and it was a total like, nope, that's not true. That's probably a fake document. You're a conspiracy theorist. And it just went to all of these illogical arguments. There was not even an inkling of curiosity there of okay, actually that is sort of a contradiction, and it was a fear-based, it's a fear-based response, right? What would happen if I accepted that the CDC is pushing an unscientific practice at the highest level? What does that say about them? What does that say about their intentions, about the institutions that I follow, that govern me, that fund me? And it's the fear of, what could happen even in the day-to-day life. Like I know that I can't take part in institutionalized academia. I know that I've given that up by speaking out. I know that I cannot be a licensed practitioner. I know that I cannot be a part of these institutions. And to be in those for 30 years of your lives and commit to this one theory, then there's the fear of saying, well, maybe I was wrong, right? So yeah, I think that's a great point.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you.
I'm really impressed with you, Liev. And part of your work that's really interesting to me, just a little bit of a quick background, is I too participated in the system and outside of the system. And one thing that's unique to all of us, it seems that we've had kind of one foot in the door, so to speak, to get this background underbelly of what's really going on. And then realizing and accepting that, like you said, there's a paradigm limit. There's literally like a steel door, and just like you don't go beyond the veil. Nobody knows what to do if you ask those questions that are outside of the general purview of what's going on. I was actually involved in a lot of Eastern style practices. I was a yoga teacher and owned yoga studios in my early life, and really focusing on what I would call the feminine aspect of health and wellness, which is the being, not the doing, and the slowing down and the getting back into nature. And then what happened when I was 20 is I got mysteriously ill, right? And at that time, I just fell into the system as it was and was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, and then proceeded to have not one, but two organ transplants. So I'm really interested in your work on the immune system and virology, specifically with organ transplants patients. We get these things that the doctors label as high antibody post-transplant, or we become highly sensitized to where we can't get transplants anymore because they feel as though these antibodies are immediately going to reject and attack the new organ in the system. So I know people literally right now who are dying, waiting. They even have donors ready to go, but the doctors are afraid because of this high PCR level, this high reactive antibody level. So all of your work around that is really personal to me and really, really fascinating. And I have a question for you. You make a really strong distinction between viruses don't exist and viruses have never been demonstrated to exist. How do you explain that nuance to someone so new in order for them to be more curious than just shut it down immediately?
Yeah, that's a great distinction. And just to comment quickly on the paradigm, what's happening now is, as Thomas Kuhn has pointed out, we're in normal science, right? And normal science has limits, right? The immune system, germ theory, virology, it has its limits, right? And that's why we call it the terrain paradigm, because it's truly a paradigm shift, right? And even to call it a theory is almost to put it into this normal science that we're doing, and so that's why we call it the paradigm, because it's a shift on all parts. Like even in immunology, as you mentioned here, we question the validity of specific antibodies, and as you mentioned, the existence of a virus. So the statement viruses do not exist and the statement viruses have never been demonstrated to exist is a very empirically based statement.
Mhm.
Logically, I think you can come to the argument that viruses do not exist. But from the empirical standpoint, which is what generally people like to discuss um, this would require some sort of empirical evidence, right? And so if there's not been demonstrated using the empirical scientific method, it's a way to get your foot in the door with the people who are in this normal science, right? With the people who are working within this previous paradigm. If they've not been demonstrated empirically, it's like, okay, what do you mean by that? Because then it's not a claim of, some guy on Instagram who just says random stuff for clickbait. Like it carries a greater weight, I guess, in the academic community, which is where a lot of us come from, right?
Yeah.
We have Kaufman, Cowan, esteemed doctors like the Baileys. We have Daniel Reuters, which was, he was a senior lecturer at universities. We have Jernea Tomzik, who was a PhD molecular biologist, and completely disregards these concepts in virology. Those are where we're drawing from. Stefan Lanka, right? One of the first.
Mhm.
The whole Perth group. There are many people who are virologists who don't come to the surface, who we have background discussions with, who completely agree with the no virus statement because we've appealed to that scientific level, right? And when you're within the confines of normal science, you have to kind of stoop to that level to make the shift, right? It's the alchemical transmutation. You start with lead,
Mhm.
you you create this, I'm blanking on my alchemical terminology, but you create this the dark matter, right? That essence, that prima material, like you break it down
Mhm.
to that basic energy and then you make gold, right? And so it's the same process,
It's
right?
almost
Of
like the
taking someone,
doctors, like when the doctors work with patients, they always say meet them where they're at. It's almost like the
sure,
new paradigm has to take that same philosophy with the old garb and meet them where they're at to be able to open and expand their mind. I think that's kind of like what you're saying.
exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, it's exactly what I'm saying. And that's it, right? You have to meet the empiricists where they're at, which is with the scientific method. And so when we say, okay, define isolation, right? Now, virology isolation has bastardized the term, right? They say isolation is taking your cough, a sample from your mucus and putting it on a cell culture. And they say, well, we've isolated a virus, and there might be a centrifugation step in there. But there's been no purification, which is the truest term of isolation, to separate from all other parts. And in science, obviously, we use the term isolation in the scientific method. We must isolate the variable in question, and we must control for the other variables. So if you have a sample and it has, just for example, you know, aluminum in it, but it has a so-called virus in it as well. And you give it to people and you say, look, the virus is causing illness in these people. It's causing a so-called immune response. Well, how do you know that it was the virus and not the aluminum, right? And this is what the scientific method does at the most basic level. It would control and say, okay, we're going to take one sample with just aluminum, one sample with just the so-called virus. we're going to give it to people as well. And only the people in the aluminum group get that response, and no one in the so-called virus group, they don't get that response, right? No one gets that response. So now we can understand that, if those were two purified samples, we understand that it was the aluminum that was the cause of the effect, right? Or at least, from a strict Popperian standpoint, you wouldn't make such a positive claim. Strict empiricism would only work through falsification, and you would, falsify that the virus causes disease. And so this is the claim that's made with the contagion studies, for example. We take people, we put them in the same room, one person's sick, one person's healthy, and disease has never been transmitted. And we have thousands of accounts, thousands of papers. When it comes to polio, Spanish flu, smallpox, chickenpox, it doesn't matter. There is a paper out there where people have tried to transmit disease, it doesn't work. So they've done that, and that's been falsified. So contagion's been falsified. That's kind of the strict empirical way to take it from a Karl Popperian standpoint. So the same could be said, right, about the methods now used in virology to try to prove a virus to exist in nature, right? And so demonstrating that in a controlled environment is that scientific claim. So say there is no virus versus viruses have never been demonstrated to exist is kind of that scientific standpoint. Now, what's the more emotionally appealing clickbait title? It's viruses do not exist. So, it's depends on, that gets into the kind of the psychology, right? One's going to target one group. Well, people will say, the people who are open to the discussion, they might say, oh, that's an intriguing claim. Let's go and dive in. And, the other one trying to appeal to sort of academia. But then you have to really go and meet them at their level, because obviously they have this sort of dissonance to looking at the truth, right? So
yes, I've seen that obvious cognitive dissonance when you ask somebody a question, out of what they're used to. It's literally almost like they go blank. When you're talking about isolating and controlling, we've done so much psychology work, relational work, attachment theory work. And when I hear things like that, I think of, oh, this sounds like a toxic relationship. And, interestingly enough, I'm curious, do you think that a true isolation or a separation between the scientist and the science can actually even exist?
Yeah, isolation, right? This is what Duhem and Quine spoke about. I asked this same question, and actually someone in my comments pointed out that Duhem and Quine already asked this question, and I was unfamiliar with their work. Isolation fundamentally does not exist in nature.
Right.
So what effect does isolation have on the scientific experiment if you can not control for the isolation?
Right.
Right? Like what effect that's an uncontrolled variable, and it's impossible to really control it at the fundamental level, which is why I personally have a problem with empiricism. And I don't think that it's valid to conduct empiricism on human bodies or in nature for that matter. So I think empiricism is a completely flawed concept. I think the only value in it is from an absolutely strict Popperian standpoint, where we only use falsification. We make absolutely no positive claim using empiricism. So even when I pointed out the aluminum example, even to say that aluminum causes this disease would be a positive claim, because some people get injected with aluminum and they don't end up with all these degenerative diseases, so there must be something else at play. Which I do agree with. There's obviously more at play than just the injections, right? It's not to say that they're not extremely harmful, inherently harmful, and but there is more at play, right? So I actually don't like the strict empirical standpoint. I use it only as a tool to kind of get people out of the normal science that we're in. That's kind of why I like to study logic and use a more rationalism point of view when it comes to approaching what is healthy versus what is unhealthy, right? What's going to lead us towards health and vitality? What's going to lead us towards death and disease? And I think we can approach this very logically, and um, it's quite simple, right? What is natural is healthy, and what is unnatural is unhealthy, right? And so that's sort of the logical. These are the foundations that we stand on, and we start with premises that are irrefutable, and we work from there so that we don't end up somewhere totally flawed. Now, maybe you could argue that even logically, there's barriers to that method of formulating theories and philosophies, and I would we would probably end up agreeing because there's this weird thing in this world where everything is like a paradox, like and it's like it's kind of funny, like there's always like this huge contradiction at every point, like um and then it's that kind of gets into a deeper discussion. Not that, again, words aren't meaningless, they carry great value, and we have to be careful semantically if we do start to engage in rationalism and um pure use of logic. But there's an essence that words carry, and again, this is what the alchemists spoke of. They spoke of this essence that is unnameable. It was this essence carried beyond the words that we speak or the experiments that we do. Like, you can use empiricism to kind of get answers, but only if it's truly aligned with nature, right? With our, fundamental ways of being. So again, it kind of comes back to sort of this thing beyond science, like, and again, this is not my approach of talking with scientists, but I think I'm in a safe space right now. Um, like if I was talking to, a professor or something, I wouldn't go down this route, but um, it's there's an essence to these words. So and I think that's an important thing. And that's why I kind of like the study of alchemy as well, because it's trying to understand sort of the essence and meaning behind the words that we carry. And I think this is why traditionally we all spoke in story rather than theories and philosophies. We spoke of stories, right? Like
Yeah.
ancestrally, everything was passed down through story.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
in a story, you convey an essence that's not said by the words. That's why the alchemists say lead into gold. And if you want to be led astray, try and do alchemy empirically.
Yeah.
You'll surely fail. So like you have to understand the essence. That's the importance of story. And I think that's the direction in which Beyond Train will move as well, is less into this sort of scientific, I want it to be a full place for people to undergo this transformation. But in moving forward through, the deeper that you go, you have to eventually let go of even empiricism itself, right? Which is again one of these things that hard for us to question, right? Oh, the fear of, if I can't trust empiricism, what can I trust?
Hmm.
Like, yes, it
Yeah.
comes back to the same thing, right? So
Yeah.
Mhm.
I
So
hope I
so
answered
when
your question. I think I went off a little
That
bit
was great.
there.
I'd like to ask a little follow-up on that. Is when you say
Sure.
what is natural is healthy and what is unnatural is unhealthy, can you define what you mean by natural and unnatural?
Yeah, and I don't think to be honest with you, it's very hard to draw the line. It's extremely difficult to draw the line. And is there a black and white line? Is a crow's nest natural? Well, the crow made it. Does that make it unnatural? Right? Is a teepee or a wigwam natural? Is a mud hut natural? We made those things. Is a wooden spear natural? Like, at what point does something then become unnatural? I think this is the very difficult line for us to draw. Now, practically, I think it becomes a lot easier to kind of draw this line. And philosophically, I think it's almost impossible, at least at this point in my thinking, to really draw this line. And um, I know Corey does some great work here. You probably have a really great answer for this question, but
Mhm.
from the practical standpoint, drawing the line, I say the causes of disease is something I speak of. a lot of. I speak in the causes of disease, the three root causes of disease. I speak of toxicities, deficiencies, and traumas. And those are the three causes of disease. And I would say that these are three categories of unnatural things. And so toxicities, very simply, is anything that is synthetic, right? And I think that that word encapsulates the essence of toxicity well. Anything that's synthetic in any capacity is going to be a toxicity. The dose here does not make the poison, right? Polyfluoro compounds, the PFAS, the BPAs, the plastics, these industrial cleaners, preservatives, food dyes, colorings, non-native electromagnetic frequencies, in any quantities, these will be toxicities. And these are all completely unnatural. Now, within the category of toxicities, we also have natural toxicities, right? Because people have to challenge me there, and they're like, oh, well, snake venom isn't natural, right? And so, or it's natural, but it's still a toxicity, right? So a toxicity is also all that which is natural out of balance. So even water can be a toxicity if you drink too much, a myth of, you can drink yourself to death even of water, right? Alcohol is technically a naturally occurring, molecule to reduce it to that. But in the wrong quantities, it becomes a toxicity. Even lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, aluminum, all of these are natural elements. Now, they are in unnatural quantities when they rain down from the sky, from our exhausts, from mining, from destroying our earth, from metal work, mining, smithing, all this different stuff. So we get them in unnatural quantities, and they contaminate our waterways, and they contaminate the food that we eat, and they contaminate the land, and they contaminate our lungs. So even something like a heavy metal is technically natural. So when people freak out about a little bit of lead in a spring water, unless it's been contaminated from an unnatural source like mining or smithing historically, or perhaps, obviously the chemtrails, stuff like that, then yes, it's a problem. But if it's just a naturally occurring amount of heavy metal, it's not a problem. Like fish, I don't concern myself with eating fish. I don't eat farm fish, but wild fish, even though it has heavy metals, I don't concern myself with that because they're in the natural quantities for the most part. Obviously, I know that we've really done a number on our natural world, but so those are toxicities, right? It's anything that is out of balance that's natural, and anything that is synthetic. So anything that is really, even you could think of this on many different levels. Like I mentioned, non-native electromagnetic frequencies, right? The confines of these four walls that we live within, not including the building material, which are of the most toxic materials that we face. But even just the stagnation of this air is an unnatural state of the air. Even an oxidized heavy metal is a terrible thing to put in our body, right? If it's oxidized, it's in a different state. And that's kind of the role of microbes. They bioremediate. They can reduce these metals. They can add electrons and energies to these metals, like Staphylococcus, for example, can reduce cobalt from +3 to +6, making it more utilizable by the body so that we can use it and integrate it, right? Deficiencies is anything natural that we lack. So we can lack sunlight, nature, love, connection, nutrients, all of these things we can lack. It's anything that's natural that we can lack. So these are, again, unnatural. And generally this takes form in our habits. So we indulge in, processed food, or we decide to binge a TV show rather than spending time with our loved ones, right? These are the forms that these, and toxicities and deficiencies, they just go hand in hand generally. Generally, when you're avoiding something natural, you're introducing a toxicity in some capacity. And so even something like stress, for example, you can be deficient in in stress. I know this sounds crazy, right? But if you don't ever do anything hard, that's not good for us either. It's good to do hard things. It's good to go outside when it's raining or snowing or whatever it may be. It's good to do these healthy, it's natural to do these things, right? So we call it stress and it has such a negative connotation, right? But even moving your body puts a stress, technically speaking, on your body. Now I think the negative aspect of it doesn't occur when you do natural movement. Now, if you're deadlifting in the gym, this is an unnatural movement, right? We should be sitting on the floor like I'm doing right now. This is a natural form of resting. Our feet should be straight when we walk. If they duck feet, this is an unnatural movement pattern. These things do contribute to this toxicity and maybe even deficiency of certain aspects of our body, like lymphatic flow or cerebral spinal fluid flow, when we're not in these natural movement patterns. So these are the kind of the manifestations of unnatural phenomenon that eventually lead to dis-ease, that lead to disconnection with our known environment, right? And this is why I truly think that we can sum up dis-ease as disconnection from the creator, right? Disconnection from creation. We can very simply sum up disease in that capacity, right? And again, where do we draw these black and white lines? I think that question's quite difficult. But I think if we come back to these sort of fundamental starting points, like these premises, these axioms, it starts to just make sense, right? It's like, am I honoring myself, my community, the creator, creation when I do this? Great question to ask yourself. And if the answer is no, you're probably contributing to dis-ease in some capacity. It may not be physical, it may manifest psychologically, spiritually. But these are essentially the concepts. Trauma is one thing I haven't mentioned. I think there's a great discussion to go on there. I'm very meticulous and careful about the way in which I discuss this because I don't think that we should employ this victim consciousness attributed to it. But there's physical traumas, right? You fall and break your arm. This is technically a form of dis-ease. Is it unnatural to fall and break your arm? It's like, generally people break bones. Like I broke my humerus playing hockey. Is hockey the most natural sport? I mean, if I was out playing on a lake, I wouldn't have hit the boards. If I wasn't playing in such capacity, it was hitting hockey. It wasn't how the old natives used to play hockey. You know what I mean? Like it's a very different essence to the sport, right? So even in that capacity, like hard to draw these lines, but I think there's a great case to be made even with non-contact injuries, right? ACL tears, meniscus tears. These, anthropologically speaking, were not observed in traditional societies, even though they moved every single day quite vigorously. They hunted great game, small game, and obviously there stuff happens, right? That's the way of the life, but these non-contact injuries, like getting up and running, you wouldn't tear your ACL if you were aligned with the natural movement patterns, right? And there's many philosophies that study that one. I really like the Goda philosophy. If you love movement, greatest of all time actions is a great philosophy to study. They study ancestral people who've never worn shoes. They look at their movement patterns. They study babies who have prime movement pattern. I'm seeing that with my young one now. She has perfect biomechanics. They study centurions who can still run, and they study the greatest of all time athletes, and they look at their movement patterns, they take it together, and then they create sort of this philosophy. And maybe it's a little bit rigid and I could probably dissect it and criticize it, but I think it's generally a great starting point. Yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question. It's best to kind of give out some examples to discuss this, because I think drawing that black and white line is difficult, if not impossible. At least it's possible where I'm at right now.
Hmm.
I think that's a great answer.
Yeah.
I'll
Great
just say I probably won't have another guest on the show that's more fitting for this topic of appeal to nature, since you mention it in a very philosophical way, right? We're dealing with health concepts, but you're bridging that gap between health and philosophy quite well. on that topic. And that's part of the reason why your work appealed to me, because I create a whole philosophy called Natureosophy, which emphasized that we should appeal to nature and that if we don't, we'd risk the appeal to denature, where we justify man-made drugs or laws or systems because of the evil of nature. So we're using that as an excuse essentially for evil. And basically what you explained, I think, is well said. I mean, you said, oh, well, maybe I could define it later in time. Can you define nature? I mean, you said multiple times it's kind of hard to do that, because if you do that, you make it a very rational sort of box, which can nature be kind of put in that box, right? It's a very ironic thing, as you mentioned, and this is also why I talk a lot about opposites. And Stephanie mentioned feminine, because we often live in a masculine world, we say, where we're pushing ourselves too hard, we're always having to rush here and there. I mentioned in the philosophy that nature is good insofar as is known. And that knowledge takes time, it takes learning, right? And that means also recognizing our ignorance. And what is natural to occur may not be what is natural to exist, and what is natural to exist may not be what is natural to use, and that everything natural does have a time and place, but that requires our knowledge. And so, because of the time and the learning process, that means that even when we think we know, we don't. And one of the oldest spiritual teachings is like, recognizing your ignorance is the wisdom. Recognizing what you don't know is the very sign that you do know. So I find it profound. And the three steps I give people is radical honesty, taking a step back, and then compensation for the things that are unnatural. We introduce what is natural. And you gave some good examples. And even in your background, you have plants. Right. So you mentioned that the air is stagnant in these four walls, and I would agree. I have plants as well, and it's been shown in studies that plants will benefit our health. So just wanted to give some examples. And I think when you talk about the terrain, what comes to mind for me is permaculture, is creating that environment where we are in touch with nature. So my question for you, if you don't mind, would be, how does raw animal products, come into play with this? Because when we're talking about appealing to nature and looking at our past and traditions, I came across your work when I found someone called the Natural Human Diet. And, again, we encourage our audience to think for themselves and to evaluate these ideas and think critically. And these might be ideas that really shock people. And it's in this direction of where we're challenging virology, we're challenging the CDC and what they're telling us is dangerous. Here in Florida, where I live, it's actually illegal to drink raw milk. They say it's for pet consumption only. And there's actually farms being raided nearly every single week, having to throw out thousands of dollars of products. So what do you think about this whole like raw animal product thing? And does that relate to what you're talking about? Because I figured that would be kind of a good segue.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely fits very well into this discussion. I've been yeah, Wes Rowe was who you were mentioning there. He's a great soul, great guy. He's a very intuitive man, and he does his due diligence and quite a lot of research, but I know that he also does a lot of things just based off these fundamental principles. I interviewed him about a couple times now, and we've chatted quite a lot, and he takes these messages from within, like the way he raises his I believe it's oh no, it's his son. I think he has a son, and his child, right? And a lot of these things he doesn't need this empirical confirmation. As you mentioned, even studies like show that plants are good in the household. It's like, who needs a study to prove that to be true, right? It's like, why do we need a study to prove that? Like that doesn't make any sense. And I think that's, again, just kind of a good example I want to point out of, like, we don't need empiricism to validate these claims, right? We don't need empiricism to tell us that having plants in your home is a good thing, right? Anyways, segueing into the raw meat discussion. Yeah, Wes was really the first guy that I kind of saw, and it intrigued me. And um, we're sold this narrative that cavemen discovered fire and then they started cooking their food, right? We're all kind of told this, even just kind of subliminally, right? Like we're told this narrative, right? Like, native man, primitive man had fire. They cooked over the fire, right? It's very subliminal. It's never really taught. Never really look at the anthropological evidence, And so I've been doing a lot of that as of recent. Every single tribe, untouched civilization around the entire planet, from the Eskimos and the Inuits up north here, down to the Aborigines in Australia, the Pacific Islanders, the Amazonian peoples, the you know, the Gaelics, it doesn't matter. Around the world, traditionally, raw food was prioritized. Raw animal food, raw meat, organs, every single part of the animal was consumed. They actually even would ferment their food, their meat, and they would dig a hole, wrap it in some hide, put it in the ground. They would let it rot, and they would use this as the most pure form of medicine. Simple as that, right? These things seem disgusting to us in this modern world, but this is an ancestral truth. And again, the you have to really do your due diligence when studying anthropology, because you can go and say, oh, well, I went to, the reservation and they're all eating cooked food. And it's like, okay, well, like, are they living a traditional lifestyle? Generally, my rule of thumb is if they're wearing shoes, and not some traditional sort of, maybe leather footwear, especially up north, they obviously wore leather, but if they're wearing modern shoes or modern clothes, they've been adulterated, right? We've removed this gold standard of primitive man. So for example, there's this Indian documentary, the one where they show those Sentinelese Islanders, right? The only untouched tribe left in the world. Wouldn't it be great if we could go and study those tribes, and see what they did? But hold on, in the 60s, 70s, the Indian government, they went to this island, they dropped off pharmaceutical drugs, like antibiotics. They dropped off food, plastics, steel pans, cookware, and they've, again, adulterated the people, right? They have removed this gold standard of the primitive way of life. So going and studying them would be in futility, right? So a couple islands south, the same documentary, halfway through the documentary, you'll see that there's a group of people and they're cooking their meat over the fire. And the narrator says very subtly, up until 60 years ago, this tribe has never cooked food. Ever. They had fire, but they never cooked their food. They didn't know what cooked food was. We had to show them how to cook their food. How primitive and savage, right? The gold standard is a raw animal-based diet. There's no doubt about it. Now, there are accounts, I will say that there are accounts where sometimes plants are consumed and sometimes, smoked food, or even, light emphasis on lightly cooked food is consumed in the natural order. Now, again, within a full holistic approach here, this was compensated by other variables, like they would consume plays. Oftentimes they would consume a natural form of water, right? They would drink from puddles and ponds and lakes. They wouldn't need to find a spring, a pure spring. And sometimes stuff like that was used medicinally, or if they had access to it, but they were in true connection with the natural environment. So this is truly the holistic approach. So, in my, I'm not a purist. I don't purely eat raw animal foods. I implement them into my life on a daily basis. But I understand that if I truly want to heal, I'm going to get back to that purity of nature. If I want to have the fastest, most effective healing protocol, it's going to be a pure return to nature in every capacity. It's going to be moving naturally. It's going to be walking a lot, right? It's going to be not carrying things in the front, carrying things on the back. It's going to be eating raw animal food, 95% of your food intake, right? Like, these are the principles that constitute a pure healing diet. And I think anthropologically, there's tons of evidence for this. It's just a fundamental truth of nature. I mean, you think of the very simple argument, we're the only animal to cook our food in the entire world, right? It's like, okay, and we think, oh, well, we've been doing this for millions and years and evolution and we've evolved and blah blah blah. There's a whole lot of discussion that could happen about topics, but it's like just because we had fire doesn't mean that we were cooking our food. Anthropologically, that's been completely disproven, right? So yeah, it fits in completely to this discussion of a true return to nature, right? Is adding in these foods. I mean, very simply, when I work with people, it's one of the first things that we do is not necessarily a full takeover, but we just add in, I have people like I do focus a lot on brain fog, chronic fatigue, a couple raw eggs in the morning, and I'm seeing people like 85, 90% improvement in like a week, and it's like they've been stuck like this for 3 years. And this is not it's not a suppression. It's not a suppression of the symptom, right? Because you're adding in the purity of nature, right? It's a sustainable thing that we can do, right? It's not this temporary suppression. So yeah, it fits perfectly. I hope I did it justice there.
To parlay for a moment on what you were talking about with the raw food and the natural health is I work with a company part-time in Australia who's more alternative, functional, holistic, and they work a lot with people with organ failure. And one of the first things they do is encourage them to do any sort of bioregulator glandular of the same organ that's in a pill form from an animal.
Absolutely. That's ancestral wisdom. Like
Right.
sports like. Yeah.
Right.
It's the
Right.
same thing that if you were to discover an uncontacted tribe, that would be the advice.
Right.
And so obviously they didn't deal with organ transplants, right? It just wasn't a reality of one, they didn't have a need for it.
Right.
They also didn't have the tools for it, but it's a difficult discussion. Interestingly, on this discussion, I'd have a few people actually in my space. They don't do content or anything like that, but they're diagnosed with, they've been given this spell or curse of type 1 diabetes, which obviously means that your pancreas is not functioning and maybe it's even destroyed, right? That your immune system attacked it, right? This autoimmune narrative. They are on a extremely pure raw animal-based diet, and they take, at this point, which they've not been doing the raw primal diet long, they take insulin every 3 or 4 days. Now, this is absolutely not medical advice. They take insulin every 3 or 4 days. They need insulin. I mean, if you think of type 1 diabetes, they need insulin at every single meal.
Right.
And on this raw primal diet,
Yeah.
suddenly your insulin intake is going way down, and they feel better than ever. And they're slowly titrating their body, and I believe rejuvenating and helping their body to completely rejuvenate that organ completely. I think that they will regrow their pancreas. They'll be so eager to follow this journey. Their goal is to never take insulin ever again. And I know that they'll achieve that goal. And I'm sure there are other case studies out there, and I hope one day that they would like to go public with that, because I think that could be really valuable. Because if you're told that your kidneys are failing, or you have this autoimmune condition where your body's attacking itself, which is a extremely problematic narrative, not that there's not damage, but just the way that we explain it. If we introduce this purity to the body, if people are reversing type 1 diabetes, which is got to be up there with the most incurable illness from the modern perspective. If there are case studies of that, this is not a miracle, right? I mean, it is, but this is nature's wisdom, which is miraculous.
I think we're on the cusp of actually really understanding that many organs besides the liver can regenerate. And we're seeing this in the CKD, the chronic kidney disease movement in Australia. They're really doing some of these things. Again, the ketogenic or carnivore-based diet is doing incredible things for people with autoimmune and with people that have these organ issues. It's something is happening where it's completely reversing people. But I think one of the problems is that spell. Is once somebody gets a diagnosis from the professional, it is almost impossible to break that mental spell. And you need some very strong mental wisdom in order for them to relax into this new paradigm. I mean, could you imagine if we could regenerate organs and reverse autoimmune diseases more effortlessly. It's going to take a massive mental paradigm shift as well, for the patient to literally go against the expert's orders is the first line of order to do that. And thank goodness, thank God, we're seeing more and more people come out on YouTube that are consciously going against their doctor's orders and following what their body is intuitively telling them and finding the right people to steward that. And I think getting people to reconnect with their intuition. I think one of the massive narratives that we have going on here in the West is to really decouple our potential, our wisdom, our body's wisdom and intuition, from our lives, from our day-to-day lives. I know for me, every issue I had or broken bone I had, or when I was diagnosed with my autoimmune disease, it was when I reverse engineered it and I kind of sat and thought back, why did this happen to me? The evidence was always very clear. I could always determine what the deficiency was. And it was those same factors that you discussed. It was a nutritional deficiency. It was a love deficiency, a trauma deficiency. You could always see that the cause behind it. And I think moving to this paradigm to give people the opportunity to shift that mindset before something detrimental happens. And then we say, oh, my experience led to so much wisdom because I was diagnosed for 10 years and laid in bed in a coma. And then I woke up and had all this wisdom. What if we didn't have to go through as much suffering to learn some of these lessons that our body, I believe, is just dripping wisdom to us each and every day, but that we relearn to trust ourselves and to remember, as you say, the power of just the human being and the connections that we have, instead of relying and outsourcing so much into this material paradigm. So thank you so much. I mean, for your wisdom. I have one last question for you personally. You talk about all of these wonderful things, and back to virology, the four horsemen theory that you talk about. If you could design one gold standard experiment to test the viral model, or just the healthcare model in general, the narrative that we use in the model today, what would that look like?
I think I came from a very empirical point of view, especially initially, and I studied empiricism and I studied the scientific method, not only through, what I was taught in academia, but I really evaluated it with a high level of scrutiny. And I think that we have the data, for lack of better terms. I think we have the data. I think when you study anthropology in any capacity, with an inkling of knowledge about what a gold standard would be, right? So from a health standpoint, I would say read Weston A. Price. I think that book, is an amazing paradigm shifting read. It's a very enjoyable read. You learn a lot about ancestral wisdom, and you see a very clear scientific approach. Is it a strict scientific method of isolation and whatever? I don't think that you can ever get to a gold standard empirical. As I was kind of alluding to earlier with, the whole isolation question. If we isolate something, is it truly, natural? But Weston A. Price, he showed two groups of people from the same tribe. One, the primitive lifestyle, or at least a very close representation of the primitive lifestyle. They might have still ate cooked foods, like the Swiss and the Gaelics that he studied. They ate, rye bread and cooked foods and stews and stuff like that. So, like, is that the primitive gold standard? Not necessarily. They still were in perfect health, right? Compared to the same groups of people, the same Swiss and Gaelic people who ate the modern foods. They lived near railroads or near cities and towns where they were able to trek in and get the food. And they were riddled with disease, cavities, facial deformities, tuberculosis, you name it, they had it, right? He did this with tribes around the world. He did it with the Inuits. He did it with the Aborigines, again, the Pacific Islanders. He did it with the African tribes. He did it with the Amazonian Peruvian tribes. He did it with everyone, right? I think that was, to me, got to be at least a really great starting point to get the people thinking in a different way about that gold standard of health. The primitive people is the gold standard, an untouched primitive person. I don't think that we have any left in the world. Even the North Sentinelese have been adulterated. We have documented evidence of this. So I don't think that there's a gold standard now in this modern day and age. And even, Wes Rowe, he's been on the diet. Derek Nance been on the diet, the raw primal diet, 15 years. Is he a gold standard? Technically, no. Right? Technically, no. Technically he's not. Right? One, we don't know, everyone's home situation and psychological world. And I think that plays huge role. And everyone's affected by this in some capacity in this modern world. We work jobs that we don't care about, and we interact with people who are miserable. What effect does this have on the psyche, on our mental health, right? So I think that we have the data. I think when we study anthropology, when we look at nature, I think when you go outside and you sit by a stream for 8 hours without your phone, you're going to learn a lot more than you can ever do in a book too. That's the gold standard level of learning. It's getting close to God. It's getting close to nature. That's the gold standard, in my opinion. When it comes to virology, again, I think we've completely falsified it. There have been people who actually attempt control experiments. Stefan Lanka controlled the experiments. He controlled the methods used in a cell culture and created supposed viruses without the addition of a virus to the sample. So using only the methods, only the cell culture, only the starvation of the cells, only the addition of streptomycin, antibiotics, and antifungals, only the methods create viruses. Right? So that's the uncontrolled variable that's never accounted for, the supposed mock infection, the phantom mock infection. Anytime there's a true mock infection in virology, I know those probably are some scientific terms, but they've all falsified virology, right? We falsified it from a laboratory standpoint. The laboratory methods, electron microscopy is uncontrolled for. The same with serology, antibodies, same with PCR, same with the cell culture. They've all been falsified. And then you only have truly the gold standard, which has been falsified thousands of times, human control experiments. You take a healthy person. This is what Robert Koch spoke about in 1860s. You take a healthy person, you give them a isolated bacteria or supposed virus or even parasites. They've done it with parasites. You give it to healthy people. If they get sick and you truly gave them an isolated purity of this organism, they get sick, you can re-isolate the organism and make sure it's the same organism, then yes, you've fulfilled Koch's postulates, the criteria that this is the cause of this disease. It's never been done. Robert Koch would ground up nodules, tuberculosis nodules, and feed them to supposedly healthy animals. But you took a nodule, which is probably full of toxicity, ground it up, and then gave it to healthy people. So again, there's confounding variables that have not been accounted for. So Koch's postulates, again, has never been accounted for because we've bastardized the term isolation, right? So there is a little bit of reading between the lines here. Just because a paper says something doesn't mean that it's true. This is a classic appeal to authority. Just because a paper says we isolated the virus doesn't mean that, when we look at the definition of isolation or the definition of a virus, doesn't mean that they did it, right? We have to look at the methods section. We have to look at the results section, not the abstract, not the introduction, not the discussion section. You have to look at the methods used. That's what science is about. And listen, I went through the ringer in academia. There's a reason why the citation errors are so common in the scientific literature, is because scientists skim abstracts and cite from the abstract, both of which are citation errors. They cite from the introduction, or they cite a citation. These are all citation errors. These are all unscientific ways to write a paper in science. This only scratches the surface of the problems in science, academia, the peer review process. But I think the evidence is out there. I have my reservations about empiricism, so I will not answer that question.
Sounds
I'm
good.
wondering, given that so much of our world has been contaminated and adulterated, right? How do you advise in that people to source their food, right? Given that our food has been contaminated as well, and how, especially if we're looking at raw meat, where do people, source the purest food?
I guess option one would be raise it yourself, which is not always convenient. I don't
Mhm.
raise my own food, right? I know that's not an option for all of us. I know that it's a goal for many of us. I'd love to raise my own food. I think that's something that my family's working on. Um, the next best option is to know thy farmer. Get to know them. I mean, if you know them, I know which stall and which whatever the milk that I'm getting from my farmer. I know the cow. I know the name of the cow, the kid's name of the cow. I know their kids. I know his wife. I know his parents. And I didn't grow up with these people. I'm from Prince Edward Island. I met this guy a couple of years ago, but I still know his whole family. I'm getting to know his community. I know his land. I've walked his land. I've walked through his barn. I've walked through the chicken coop. I've walked through where he counts his eggs in the basement. You know what I mean? Like I know every step of the way.
Mm.
I know all of the equipment that he uses and that he doesn't use. I know the feed that he doesn't use. He doesn't use feed for his animals, right? I mean, he gets hay in the wintertime, it gets cold here. They can't graze on pasture all summer, but he uses hay, right? I know my farmer. I know that he doesn't vaccinate them. I know that he doesn't give them antibiotics. I know that when a cow steps on her tit, she becomes ground beef. He's not going to try to force that cow to heal with antibiotics and injections and pharmaceutical drugs. And I know the disease that poor cow faced, while she was put out of her misery and she's going to a good cause, right? Like this is it. I also know that most of us in this modern world could not handle being a farmer. I know that's the truth too.
Mhm.
But I think that again, coming back to this concept of responsibility, it's like if you can do that, whew, good for you. Because you could wake up every single morning, do the same thing. If you could do that and thank God every day, I think you'll be all right. I
Mhm.
think you'll be a-okay. I know the people, it's funny, like you talk about health and longevity, and it's like, what does that mean? And I had a great guest on the podcast who said, I don't care about longevity, I care about sustainability. It's like, I want to be able to move until the day that I die,
Mhm.
and I really like that. Um, because like I fished lobster commercially when I was actually in COVID, in PEI there, and I remember talking to the captain of my boat, and he mentioned how his mom, she was 86 years old, and she was still running that shit, fishing lobster every season. This is not easy work, right? You're lifting traps that are 110 pounds dry,
Wow.
you know, think of it when it's soaked wet, full of lobster, right? And she's pulling them on the boat, running the holler. She's like until she passed. She fished until she passed. And I know for a fact that she didn't skip too many beers or cigarettes. You know what I mean? Like, so, but there's this you know importance in this simplicity, right? And so even like I have to drive an hour and a half to go get milk. An hour and a half out and an hour and a half back because it's illegal here, up in beautiful Nova Scotia, Canada. But it's finding the beauty and simplicity and even doing something like that. I could be, oh no, I don't want to do it. And I wouldn't if I didn't. You have to, I'm not raising any cows right now, so I have to go and do that. But it's like it's enjoying like these little things. Like thank God to just be able to have the opportunity
Yeah.
you know? And it's
Mhm.
funny, like, you learn a great lesson when you know your farm, you know the things that go on. There was a forest fire out at his farm, like behind his land. It wasn't like it was pretty close to him. It was like a kilometer away or half a mile, and he had evacuated all of his animals to a farm an hour away. You know, could you imagine? And he had to do the same for his dad's farm because his dad broke his leg and he has 200 goats. You know what I mean? And now he's looking after two farms, a goat farm and a cow farm, and pigs and chickens, and selling and homeschooling and trying to be a husband or and faithful to God. And it's like, listen, we need to appreciate these things. We need to be grateful. And if you don't know your farm, you don't know what they're going through.
Yeah.
And you sure as hell don't know how they're raising their animals.
Wow.
So you'd
Mhm.
probably be all right to eat some, grass-fed beef at the store. I know everybody, like plenty of people do it, but I say you want to be sure, get to know your farmer.
Sure. Thank you so much, man. This has been such a great interview. You've been sharing so many different tips for people and different ideas. And hey, anybody out there who's listening, who's watching, if you have a challenge and you say, hey, he's wrong and I disagree, like we invite everybody to share their perspectives on this. This is an open forum where we're trying to see what can we change in the current system and the way we're doing things. I would say you inspired me to probably burn all the books I have and go into nature. I want to go into nature like right now. I'll be honest. But yeah, thank you so much. Is there any final notes you guys want to mention, Liev, as well?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a wonderful discussion. I love talking about this stuff. I appreciate y'all. I think you guys are doing great work, and I'm just glad to be part of it. I think this is a very exciting time. We talk about the, duality or triune nature of this realm, and um, we're obviously doing something quite unnatural at the moment, but at the same time, I think we're doing something beautiful, and
Absolutely.
we're meeting each other and we're meeting everyone where we're at, because we live in this modern world, and I know that in my life, I'm not going to be optimal,
Yeah.
I'm not going to be the optimal state. Like, it's something you got to accept, right? Now, some people have trouble with this, and there's this big craze with peptides, and there's the craze with all these supplements and plastic surgery. They want to optimize how they look and how they feel. And I agree. I think beauty is a byproduct of health. And, but then when we start acting by force and coping with these modern ways, we're again hindering the progress moving forward, right? If anything, Weston A. Price taught us is that even in a single generation, we can reverse degenerative disease just by eating our natural human diet. He showed this very clearly. So we need to think greater. We need to think more holistically, bigger than just ourselves. It's always things happen to me. Why is this happening to me? Right? Rather than what's this trying to teach me? How can
Yeah.
I improve my bloodline? How can I improve my community, the world that I live in? Doing things not just for yourself. I mean, this is what I think the essence of the Christ story is as well, right? Like, I think this is the essence of a lot of these religious texts. That sacrifice of oneself. We don't have to, you know, be so greedy and indulgent and try to just optimize our state, and then we start to tiptoe into this world of synthetics and peptides and supplements and surgeries and whatever. And this is a big problem in this day and age, right? It's a huge movement. And again, we're sold it as this greenwash narrative of oh, peptides are natural. It's like 20-step process to make a peptide. It's not natural. Vitamins aren't natural. Vitamins, again, I would say vitamins have never been demonstrated to exist, which we'll talk about next time. But
I
but
wondered
it's the
about
same.
that.
Yeah, it's true, right? So again, it's like it's just coming back to these this simplicity, looking again bigger than just ourselves, looking at, I'm not just going to try to optimize for myself, I want to optimize things I want to become the best version of myself so I can carry that essence forward. Right? And we meet each other where we're at. We use the things that we're using. If we all went, Amish or primitive, would all the problems go away? Like, who knows? Maybe not, right? It probably needs to be a slow transition. It was a slow transition into this. We probably need to transition out of it slowly. So we need to meet ourselves where we're at, right? Live in accordance with nature and the creator the best we possibly can, and just do our best, right? I
Yeah.
Absolutely.
think that's it. We just do our
So,
best.
so maybe one final question to take you out would be like, looking ahead X number of years of this gradual change, right? Of people taking on this new paradigm of health and sovereignty, right? What would be the clearest signs that it is taking root? What could we expect to see change in humanity and health and all that?
Greatest indicator will be dissolution of the government.
So that aligns well to what we're sharing with statism,
I,
without a
I
doubt.
kind of thought that would hit. No, but seriously, that'd be a good indication, right? I mean, like, it would mean that we're all being sovereign
Hmm.
in our being.
Andrew
When we
Kaufman
don't
says
need,
that.
yeah, when we don't need centralization of our health and education and food systems, we don't need big agriculture. We go back to the small town farming, we go back to small communities, we go back to the small country school, we go back to simplicity, right?
Mhm.
It's actually going to seem like we're receding, in our progress, quote
Right.
unquote,
Right.
but and again, it's like, would we ever get there on a whole scale? I know that there's a huge movement going on of people returning to simplicity. I think that's important because with
Mhm.
simplicity, with the return to nature, people feel better. If there's a reason why people move from the city to the country and not the other way around.
Mhm.
That shift is over, right? We saw that shift. They sold the farm to move to the city, and that's fail, right? There's a reason why during COVID, our housing market went insane because everyone moved out here to the country where it's vast, where the land is vast, where there's nature, where and guess what didn't happen? After COVID was over, no one went back. They all stayed. So we're seeing these small indications of coming together, smaller communities, supporting our farmers, voting with our dollars, with our energy. This is the way forward, truly.
Wow.
Liev, I have a real quick question. A lot of people
You're
talk
good.
about this, this like great bifurcation, where it's like the people that are returning to the great simplification, and then people that are focusing on longevity, transhumanism, and just the robotic movement. Do you have any thoughts on that bifurcation? What are your
Mm.
thoughts on that? Do you see that? Do you think that everybody
Yeah.
will eventually, hopefully, return to the simple side of things, or?
I think the biggest problem that the whole transhumanist synthetic agenda faces is that it's failed time and time and time and time again, and it's not a real pretty thing to talk about because it fails and it fails hard. It's unsustainable, and we think that Brian Johnson
Yeah,
is doing it up with all of his biohacking and stuff.
right,
uh it's just it fails
right.
over and over and over and over. It's never, there's not one single case where becoming more technological has decreased our disease or increased our vitality. Truly, it comes with a cost.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, anyways, I don't know what's gonna happen. Anything could
Yeah.
happen. Anything could
Right, right.
happen. Like, seriously, like, anything could happen. Who knows what's gonna happen tomorrow? Everything could be different, right?
It reminds me a
Again, it's
little bit
like,
of I was just going to say, it reminds me a little of my faith-based journey, where at some
uh,
point along my journey, it was like I was insatiable for more knowledge and more things and
uh,
more ways to get enlightened, and just seeking and seeking and seeking and seeking and seeking and seeking. And it was never ending, and it never worked. And then, like, at some point, I was like, I don't need any of this. I just need to return to God, the creator, and faith in nature. And that is all I need. But there was this process I went on of like extending outward into all the resources and enlightenment tools I could find. And at some point, I hit a wall, and it was like, I give up. I surrender. None of it's working. And that's kind of it feels to me in the transhumanist movement. It's this insatiable reach
Mhm.
it
to
is.
live forever or whatever it is. But it's like, it's almost like psychotic. There has to be like
Mhm.
a hitting of a wall and a breaking and surrender, like an ego death, to just return to, I think the only thing that does work, which is like
Psychedelics.
faith in nature. No,
I'm just kidding.
no, faith in nature.
Well, you know, you got
Maybe,
to
but
think what is the one thing that nature has to return people to nature when they're stuck in an extremely technocratic state? It might be psychedelics. I mean, but I
what do you
think,
think about that, Liev?
you know, I
Yeah,
don't know.
I mean, here's the funny thing is like I was talking to someone the other day, and um they were talking about someone close to them, and how there's this continuous, again, insatiable search for enlightenment, and they do ayahuasca every month, and we just need more ayahuasca, and we need more psychedelics, and we need more of this. Corey, I don't necessarily disagree with this,
I
maybe
agree with,
that one
yeah,
time return, but I think that we can again still get stuck in this idea that we need to be more enlightened. We need to
yes,
be more knowledgeable. We need to be more. It's the same thing, right? We
Right.
criticize, oh, the doctors, what do they always say? Well, you're ignorant. You don't understand the science. Okay,
Mhm.
but if you're being told by some guru that you're not enlightened enough, that your ego is too big, that the fear is too strong, you just need more ayahuasca, you need more
Right.
psychedelics, right? It's like it's the same thing, right?
right,
It's the
right.
Same
same
addiction.
thing, and so I think that's a really important discussion too. And what I was going to add to that was this. I lost it.
It's okay. It is like a spectrum.
Yeah,
It's
it
almost
is.
like you can have the dysfunctional spectrum, but you can have the hyper addiction to the
Mm,
novelty of psychedelics addiction. It's like one may
yeah,
look prettier, right? You're not doing heroin, you're doing ayahuasca to wake up. But, I think that we have to be so careful to get ourselves
yeah,
caught yet in another trap that looks good
Yeah.
in another disguise. And being in life and in reality. I come from a spiritual background, so I understand that narrative. And I've known so many people who actually they live in the metaphysics to the degree where they're actually really disassociative in reality. So I think
Yeah.
it's that danger of just extending too far in the opposite direction to where we're just not here and now,
Yeah.
not present.
yeah.
And
Mm,
maybe it's a mindset about how to relate to those plants, because my understanding of, Neolithic
yeah.
peoples and the primitive peoples is that there was a local plant of some sort that had psychoactive effects that then became a way of connecting into nature more so, and
Mhm.
spending time with plants and communing and communicating. That became, a shamanic activity that helped the community, that helped heal, you know, um,
Yeah, I figured to
injuries,
just
things like
mention
that.
it as
Yeah.
something because when you think of something like extremes that pull people in different directions, and Brian Johnson, you mentioned him, he had one of those experiences recently because he was looking at all the research and he's always looking at what's the research, right? So I th we're touching on a lot of different fields that would be a whole discussion of their own, but I think what you're hitting on is very important. Is like you have to see the bigger picture and look at the nuance, which means sometimes it's like something you is totally right in front of you, but yet out of sight.
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you so
Yeah, and
much
I
for
think,
your time.
oh, it came back to me. I'll finish that note just because I think it's important, again, kind of bring the whole discussion back. You know, when we talk about growth, I think one of the best things you can do is question the things that you think are absolute, right? Catching a lot of flack for some comments I made on nervous system dysregulation work. Um, I made posts recently on that, and I think that, again, like, and tying into your discussion, like when it comes to these psychological problems, there's something called the golden key. It's written by this old priest, and his name was it's called the Golden Key. And look it up. It's a little book. It's about 9 minutes long. And this priest talked about how anytime there's stress in your life, there's only one thing that you have to do. It's not nervous system dysregulation work, somatic expression, processing, EMDR, brain spotting. It's not any of these new age modalities. And listen, I've studied them. I'm trained in EMDR. I do the somatic experience. I think there's value in them. I think there's value in the psychedelic experience. I think there's value in all these things. But the golden key is just thinking about God. and
Mm.
all the anxieties, all the stress, all the worry, it all goes away. And if anything, you could take away from this episode, go listen to the Golden Key. It's 9 minutes long, and it will change your life. And again, it will stop you from needing to constantly seek the next trauma processing modality, the next nervous system regulation, the next parasite cleanse, the next this, that, the other thing. These are all just constantly seeking more and more and more and more and more from that kind of health space. So we can do this, you know, we could do this from the spiritual way, or the knowledge way, or the health way. It's all the same essence, right? And it's just coming back to that oneness, that unity, that oh. So I think that's good
Absolutely.
to end.
Yeah.
Awesome. It
Thank you
even
so
relates
much.
to
Beautiful.
Yeah, it even relates to relationships. Everything you just said is that we always think it's going to be the next best thing. And when I used to teach, we called it destination addiction. It's like,
Yes.
what next best thing is going to get me there? And it just,
Very.
from my experience, it
That's it.
turns out to be just God.
Yeah.
That's
And
it.
that's so
I
agree.
beautiful because it's actually simple and I can handle that.
I agree.
Yeah. Great. Wonderful.
How
Provocative
profound.
information. Yeah.
Amazing. So everybody, Beyond Terrain on all platforms. Be sure to check him out. Liev Dalton. He's got a lot of great videos, all different size, length of videos on all different platforms. He got vertical, horizontal. He's got guest interviews, all of it. And so you definitely want to get involved. He's also got communities where you can actually like talk with each other. I think it's a circle community, if I'm right about that. And you can do all sorts of ways to connect with other people who are like-minded or who are questioning their health, who are trying to find their path. And everybody's on a different path. Everybody's trying to find their way. So I appreciate everybody for watching. And our website is healthrevealed.org. Thank you. Take care.